Here again with the whitetail nutritional expert, my friend Todd Stittelberg. Todd, there's never been a time in my life when I have noticed more hunters out there actually trying to help deer. And one of the biggest myths, and this is going to be preaching to the choir, is that animal rights activists care more about wildlife than we do. I'm sorry, this is not true. We are striving and striving and striving to help these whitetails and to leave this world a better place than we found it. But that sometimes leads to problems as well. Well-intentioned problems. And specifically, let's talk overwinter feeding. You can do a lot of damage in the Midwest and points north with an improper winter feeding program, can't you?
Absolutely. Corn obviously is probably the most popular deer feed. It's readily available, relatively cheap. It does provide a nice source of energy, but it can also be really hard on the deer's digestive system.
Well, I believe the term is it can cause ruminant acidosis, is that correct? And
yes.
what's happening is the rumen, the first chamber in a whitetail stomach, is filled with all sorts of microbiology that's trying to break this stuff down. And it actually evolves over time. You take a northern deer, geez, right now it's it's December as we film this, they're already out there eating sticks. Their microbiology has to adapt to breaking that down. What happens when they've been eating sticks for a couple months and now all of a sudden here is some there's a huge pile of corn right there. What does that do to their system?
Well, it's extremely hard on their system. It can, in a sense, burn out the bacteria that is the good bacteria in their stomach. Probably the easiest way to explain it would be if you had a steady diet of beans. You woke up in the morning and you had beans, and you had beans for lunch, and you had beans for supper, and you did that day after day after day, you start feeling pretty uncomfortable. Yeah. And that's maybe the easiest way to explain what's going on when you do feed corn.
So how can we go ahead and, for the people that want to, institute a feeding program that does more good than harm?
There's a number of different things you can do from a good, better, best standpoint. A good program would simply, and very simple, would be to use like a high energy block, something that's got 14 to 16% protein, but has a fair amount of energy in it.
And it has to be digestible
Yes.
protein and energy as
Yes.
well.
Yes, very good sources, exactly right.
Okay,
Yeah.
so just so I go out and I buy a half dozen blocks and throw them around the woods, I'm not going to do any harm.
No, probably not. Having said that, probably the most popular deer block is a salt block. You're not going to benefit the deer herd one bit by putting out a salt block.
So let me rephrase. I go out and buy a half dozen blocks that are both high energy, high protein, and those energies and protein are in highly digestible states. I throw them out, half dozen of them out in the woods. I'm not going to create any issues.
No.
I'm going to actually it's not going to completely change the world for these whitetails, but it is just a little bump in the right direction.
Yeah, I'd even call it a bigger bump. I mean, that's going to be a pretty significant help, really.
Okay.
If you're just to use blocks.
All right, so what's better?
So the next step would be feeding probably a pelleted feed, not really high in protein. I wouldn't like to go over 16% in the winter months because feeding too high of a protein diet can burn fat off an animal also. So we don't want to do that. So we really don't want to go in excess of 16% protein, but have something with 2, 3, 4, 5% fat in it.
Okay.
So we're starting to get, really help that deer that's been under a lot of stress from the rut, from fighting. Winters came on, and now all of a sudden we're going to offer him a highly digestible food source that's going to help him start putting that weight back on and get caught back up.
Now, now let's hit the best. What's the very best you can do out there, my friend?
The very best, then, really over and above that would be to have the most highly digestible protein energy pellet with vitamins and minerals, and then to top it off with a food plot program with certain, say, brassica species or certain rye or wheats that are going to start growing in the course of, here in Wisconsin, February, March, which is going to be a real critical time period. So some of those food sources would be really high in energy, but also be high in protein in February and March as we start.
So what you're trying to do is you're trying to create that year-round.
Year-round, exactly. Right.
High-quality food source.
Absolutely.
Okay. To wrap up now, when we're talking feeding pelleted feed, is there ways, and this is a loaded question because I know the answer, is there ways to feed this that creates more stress versus less stress? When it comes to actually feeding these products, the pelleted feeds, or if somebody does go out, you can go ahead and get corn if you mix it with 4 parts oats, and now that's a little better form. It's not as good as the pelleted feed, obviously, but if you're going to do that type of feeding program, is there anything are there things you can do to minimize stress and maximize usage? What do you have to be aware of?
It kind of gets back to having one centralized feeding location is not near as good as having, let's say, a half a dozen. Spreading those areas out so we're not congregating deer.
To the point where they're we're getting benefit from the food, but at the same time we're fighting each other. You're minimizing the stress.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. If we can spread out those sites, the feeding sites, that's going to help a lot.
And consistent feeding.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So go ahead. If you're going to overwinter feed, make sure you're going to, frankly, do it right or don't bother. That's really, I hate to be that blunt, but really, if you want to do good, do it right or don't bother. Yeah. You can get away with the blocks. That's going to be a decent help. You can go ahead and supplement that then with a pelleted feed, which is going to help even more. But if you want to take it the full circle, what you do is you do both of those, you throw minerals in, and you make sure that you have a good food plot program that's trying to address their nutritional needs all year round.
And finally, the other thing is don't stop in February.
Exactly.
Don't stop in March. Yeah. The deer will tell you, when things really green up in the spring, they're going to stop coming to those feeders as much. Maybe totally lay off it. They may totally lay off. Yeah. When that happens, you can either stop feeding or
at least
really cut back.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yep.
Thank you, Todd.
Yep.